Section 2. Perception, or things and their deceptiveness. Translator's comments: in this as in the preceding section, apprehension is effected under conditions of sense. But whereas in the preceding type of consciousness the universality which knowledge implies and requires no sooner appeared than it melted away, here in perception we start from a certain stability in the manner of apprehension, and a certain constancy in the content apprehended. The universality in this case satisfies more completely the demands of knowledge. The problem for further analysis is to find the form which the universal here assumes and to determine the way in which the unity of the object, the thing, holds together its essential differences. The result shows that the unity of the thing qua unity is only admissible as an unqualified or non-sensuous unity. It is a universal, but as such, not conditioned by sense, it is a pure or unconditioned universal, a thought proper. Being undetermined by sense, it transcends sense apprehension, and so transcends perception proper, and compels the mind to adopt another cognitive attitude in order to apprehend it. This new attitude is understanding. The following section is thus indirectly an analysis and a criticism of the doctrine which reduces or confines knowledge to perception. It shows that the position must give way to the principle. End of translator's comments. Immediate certainty does not make the truth its own, for its truth is something universal, whereas certainty wants to deal with the this. Perception, on the other hand, takes what exists for it to be a universal. Universality being its principle and general, its moments immediately distinguished within it are also universal. I is a universal, and the object is a universal. That principle has arisen and come into being for us who are tracing the course of experience, and our process of apprehending what perception is, therefore, is no longer a contingent series of acts of apprehension, as is the case with the apprehension of sense certainty. It is a logically necessitated process. With the origination of the principle, both the moments, which as they appear merely fall apart as happenings, have at once together come into being, the one, the process of pointing out and indicating, the other the same process, but as a simple fact, the former the process of perceiving, the latter the object perceived. The object is in its essential nature the same as the process, the latter is the unfolding and distinguishing of the elements involved, the object is these same elements taken and held together as a single totality. For us, tracing the process, or in itself, the universal, qua principle, is the essence of perception, and as against this abstraction, both the moments distinguished that which perceives and that which is perceived are what is non-essential. But in point of fact, because both are themselves the universal, or the essence, they are both essential, but since they are related as opposites, only one can in the relation, constituting perception, be the essential moment, and the distinction of essential and non-essential has to be shared between them. The one characterized as the simple fact, the object, is the essence, quite indifferent as to whether it is perceived or not. Perceiving, on the other hand, being the process, is the insubstantial, the inconstant factor, which can be as well as not be, is the non-essential moment. This object we have now to determine more precisely, and to develop this determinate character from the result arrived at. The more detailed development does not fall in place here. Since its principle, the universal, is in its simplicity a mediated principle, the object must express this explicitly as its own inherent nature. The object shows itself by so doing to be the thing with many properties. The wealth of sense knowledge belongs to perception, not to immediate certainty, where all that wealth was merely something alongside and by the way, for it is only perception that has negation, distinction, multiplicity in its very nature. The this, then, is established as not this, or as superseded, and yet not nothing, but a determinate nothing, a nothing with a certain content, for example, the this. The sense element is in this way itself still present, but not in the form of some particular that is meant, as had to be the case in immediate certainty, but as a universal, as that which will have the character of the property. Cancelling, superseding, brings out and lays bare its true twofold meaning which we found contained in the negative. To supersede is at once to negate and to preserve. The nothing being a negation of the this, preserves immediacy and is itself sensuous, but a universal immediacy. Being, however, is a universal by its having in it mediation or negation. When it brings this explicitly out as a factor in its immediacy, it is a specifically distinct determinate property. As a result, there are many such properties set up at once, one the negation of the other. Since they are expressed in the simple form of the universal, these determinate characters which, strictly speaking, become properties only by a further additional characteristic are self-related, are indifferent to each other, each is by itself, free from the rest. The simple self-identical universality, however, is itself again distinct and detached from these determinate characteristics it has. It is pure self-relation, the medium wherein all these characteristics exist. In it, as in a bare, simple unity, they interpenetrate without affecting one another, for just by participating in this universality they are indifferent to each other, each by itself. This abstract universal medium, which we can call thinghood in general or pure essential reality, is nothing else than the here and now as this on analysis turned out to be, for example, a simple togetherness of many heres and nows. But the many, in the present case, are in their determinateness themselves simply universals. This salt is a simple here and at the same time manifold, it is white, and also pungent, also cubical in shape, also of a specific weight, and so on. All these many properties exist in a simple here, where they interpenetrate each other. None of these has a different here from the others, each is everywhere in the same here where the others are. And at the same time, without being divided by different heres, they do not affect each other in their interpenetration. Its being white does not affect or alter the cubical shape it has, and neither affects its tarred taste, and so on. On the contrary, since each is simple relation to self, it leaves the others alone and is related to these merely by being also along with them, a relation of mere indifference. This also is thus the pure universal itself, the medium, the thinghood keeping them together. In this relation, which has emerged, it is merely the character of positive universality that is first noticed and developed. But there is still a side presented to view which must also be taken into account. It is this. If the many determinate properties were utterly indifferent to each other, and were entirely related to themselves alone, they would not be determinate, for they are so, merely in so far as they are distinguished and related to others as their opposites. In view of this opposition, however, they cannot exist together in the bare and simple unity of their medium, which unity is just as essential to them as negation. The process of distinguishing them, so far as it does not leave them indifferent, but effectually excludes, negates one from another, thus falls outside this simple medium. And this, consequently, is not merely an also, an unity indifferent to what is in it, but a one as well, an excluding repelling unity. The one is the moment of negation, as, in a direct and simple manner, relating itself to itself, and excluding an other, and is that by which thinghood is determined qua thing. In the property of a thing the negation takes the form of a specific determinateness, which is directly one with the immediacy of its being, an immediacy which, by this unity with negation, is universality. Qua one, however, negation, the specific quality, takes a form in which it is freed from this unity with the object, and exists per se on its own account. These moments taken together exhaust the nature of the thing, the truth of perception, so far as it is necessary to develop it here. It is, 1, a universality, passive and indifferent, that also which forms the sole bond of connection between the qualities, or rather constituent elements, matters, existing together. 2, negation, likewise in a simple form, or the one, which consists in excluding properties of an opposite character, and 3, the many properties themselves, the relation of the two first moments the negation, as it is related to that indifferent element, and in being so expands into a manifold of differences. The focal point of particularity radiating forth into plurality within the medium of subsistence. Taking the aspect that these differences belong to a medium indifferent to what is within it, they are themselves universal, they are related merely to themselves and do not affect each other. Taking, however, the other aspect, that they belong to the negative unity, they at the same time mutually exclude one another, but do not necessarily in the shape of properties that have a separate existence apart from the also connecting them. The sensuous universality, the immediate unity of positive being and negative exclusion, is only then a property when oneness and pure universality are evolved from it and distinguished from one another, and when that sensuous universality combines these with one another. Only after this relation of the unity to those pure essential moments is effected, is the thing complete. This, then, is the way the thing in perception is constituted, and consciousness is perceptual in character. So far as this thing is its object, it has merely to take the object and assume the attitude of pure apprehension, and what comes its way in so doing is truth. If it did something when taking the given, it would by such supplementation or elimination alter the truth. Since the object is the true and universal, the self-same, while consciousness is the variable and non-essential, it may happen that consciousness apprehends the object wrongly and deceives itself. The percipient is aware of the possibility of deception, for, in the universality forming the principle here, the percipient is directly aware of otherness, but aware of it as null and not, as what is superseded. His criterion of truth is therefore self-sameness, and his procedure is that of apprehending what comes before him as self-same. Since, at the same time, diversity is a fact for him, his procedure is a way of relating the diverse moments of his apprehension to one another. If, however, in this comparison a want of sameness comes out, this is not an untruth on the part of the object, for the object is the self-same, but on the part of perception. Let us now see what sort of experience consciousness forms in the course of its actual perception. We, who are analyzing the process, find this experience already contained in the development, just given, of the object and of the attitude of consciousness towards it. The experience will be merely the development of the contradictions that appear there. The object which I apprehend presents itself as purely one and single, also, I am aware of the property in it, a property which is universal, thereby transcending the particularity of the object. The first form of being, in which the objective reality has the sense of a one, was thus not its true being, and since the object is the true fact here, the untruth falls on my side, and the apprehension was not correct. On account of the universality of the property, I must rather take the objective entity as a community in general. I further perceive now the property to be determinate, opposed to another and excluding this other. Thus, in point of fact, I did not apprehend the object rightly when I defined it as a commonness or community with others, or as continuity, and must rather, taking account of the determinateness of the property, isolate parts within the continuity and set down the object as a one that excludes. In the disintegrated one I find many such properties, which do not affect one another, but are indifferent to one another. Thus I did not apprehend the object correctly when I took it for something that excludes. The object, instead, just as formerly it was merely continuity in general, is not a universal common medium where many properties in the form of sense universals subsist, each for itself and on its own account, and, qua determinate, excluding the others. The simple and true fact, which I perceive, is, however, in virtue of this result, not a universal medium either, but the particular property by itself, which, again, in this form, is neither a property nor a determinate being, for it is now neither attached to a distinct one nor in relation to others. But the particular quality is a property only when attached to a one, and determinate only in relation to others. By being this bare relation of self to self, it remains merely sensuous existence in general, since it no longer contains the character of negativity, and the mode of consciousness, which is now aware of a being of sense, is merely a way of meaning or intending, that is to say, it has left the attitude of perception entirely and gone back into itself. But sense existence and meaning themselves pass over into perception, I am thrown back on the beginning, and once more dragged into the same circuit, that supersedes itself in every moment and as a whole. Consciousness, then, has to go over this cycle again, but not in the same way as on the first occasion. For it has found out, regarding perception, that the truth and outcome of perception is its dissolution, is reflection out of and away from the truth into itself. In this way consciousness becomes definitely aware of how its perceptual process is essentially constituted, for example, that this is not a simple bare apprehension, but in its apprehension is at the same time reflected out of the true content back into itself. This return of consciousness into itself, which is immediately involved and implicated in that pure apprehension for this return to self, has proved to be essential to perception, alters the true content. Consciousness is aware that this aspect is at the same time its own, and takes it upon itself, and by so doing consciousness will thus get the true object bare and naked. In this way we have, now, in the case of perception, as happened in the case of sensuous certainty, the aspect of consciousness being forced back upon itself, but, in the first instance, not in the sense in which this took place in the former case, to wit, not as if the truth of perception fell within it. Rather, consciousness is aware that the untruth, that comes out there, falls within it. By knowing this, however, consciousness is able to cancel and supersede this untruth. It distinguishes its apprehension of the truth from the untruth of its perception, corrects this untruth, and, so far as itself takes in hand to make this correction, the truth, qua truth of perception, certainly falls within its own consciousness. The procedure of consciousness, which we have now to consider, is thus so constituted that it no longer merely perceives, but is also conscious of its reflection into self, and keeps this apart from the simple apprehension proper. To begin with, then, I am aware of the thing as a one and have to keep it fixed in this true character as one. If in the course of perceiving something crops up contradicting that, then I must take it to be due to my reflection. Now, in perception various different properties also turn up, which seem to be properties of the thing. But the thing is a one, and we are aware in ourselves that this diversity, by which the thing ceases to be a unity, falls in us. This thing, then, is, in point of fact, merely white to our eyes, also tarred to our tongue, and also cubical to our feeling, and so on. The entire diversity of these aspects comes not from the thing, but from us, and we find them falling apart thus from one another, because the organs they affect are quite distinct inter se, the eye is entirely distinct from the tongue, and so on. We are, consequently, the universal medium where such elements get dissociated, and exist each by itself. By the fact, then, that we regard the characteristic of being a universal medium as our reflection, we preserve and maintain the self-sameness and truth of the thing, its being a one. These diverse aspects, which consciousness puts to its side of the account, are, however, each by itself just as it appears in the universal medium, specifically determined. White is only in opposition to black, and so on, and the thing is a one just by the fact that it is opposed to other things. It does not, however, exclude others from itself, so far as it is one, for to be one is to be in a universal relation of self to self, and hence by the fact of its being one it is rather like all. It is through the determinate characteristic that the thing excludes other things. Things themselves are thus determinate in and for themselves, they have properties by which they distinguish themselves from one another. Since the property is the special and peculiar property, the proper property of the thing, or a specific characteristic in the thing itself, the thing has several properties. For, in the first place, the thing is true being, is a being inherently in itself, and what is in it is so as its own essential nature, and not on account of other things. Hence, in the second place, the determinate properties are not on account of other things and for other things, but inherent in that thing itself. They are, however, determinate properties in it only by the fact that they are several, and maintain their distinction from one another. And, in the third self-contained, each in and for itself, and are indifferent to one another. It is, then, in truth the thing itself which is white, and also cubical, and also tart, and so on. In other words, the thing is the also, the general medium, wherein the many properties subsist externally to one another, without touching or affecting one another, and without cancelling one another, and, so taken, the thing is taken as what it truly is. Now, on this mode of perception arising, consciousness is at the same time aware that it reflects itself also into itself, and that, in perceiving, the opposite moment to the also crops up. This moment, however, is the unity of the thing with itself, a unity which excludes distinction from itself. It is consequently this unity which consciousness has to take upon itself, for the thing as such is the subsistence of many different and independent properties. Thus we say of the thing, it is white, and also cubical, and also tart, and so on. But so far as it is white it is not cubical, and so far as it is cubical and also white it is not tart, and so on. Putting these properties into a one belongs solely to consciousness, which, therefore, has to avoid letting them coincide and be one, that is to say, one and the same property, in the thing. For that purpose it introduces the idea of insofar to meet the difficulty, and by this means it keeps the qualities apart, and preserves the thing in the sense of the also. Quite rightly consciousness at first makes itself responsible for the oneness in such a way that what was called a property is represented as being free matter. In this way the thing is raised to the level of a true also, since it thus becomes a collection of component elements, materials or matters, and instead of being a one becomes a mere enclosure, a circumscribing surface. If we look back on what consciousness formerly took upon itself, and now takes upon itself, what it previously ascribed to the thing, and now ascribes to it, we see that consciousness alternately makes itself, as well as the thing, into both a pure atomic many less one, and an also resolved into independent constituent elements, materials or matters. Consciousness thus finds through this comparison that not only its way of taking the truth contains the diverse moments of apprehension and return upon itself, but that the truth itself, the thing, manifests itself in this twofold manner. Here we find, as a result of experience, that the thing exhibits itself, in a determinate and specific manner, to the consciousness apprehending it, but at the same time is reflected back into itself out of that manner of presenting itself to consciousness. In other words, the thing contains within it opposite aspects of truth, a truth whose elements are in antithesis to one another. Consciousness, then, gets away also from this second form of perceptual procedure, that, namely, which takes the thing as the true selfsame, and itself as the reverse, as the factor that leaves sameness behind and goes back into self. Its object is now the entire process which was previously shared between the object and consciousness. The thing is a one, reflected into self, it is for itself, but it is also for another, and, further, it is an other for itself as it is for another. The thing is, hence, for itself and also for another, a being that has difference of a twofold kind. But it is also one. Its being one, however, contradicts the diversity it has. Consciousness would, consequently, have again to make itself answerable for putting the diversity into the one, and would have to keep this apart from the thing. It would thus be compelled to say that the thing insofar as it is for itself is not for another. But the oneness belongs to the thing itself, too, as consciousness has found out. The thing is essentially reflected into self. The also, the distinction of elements indifferent to one another, falls doubtless within the thing as well as the oneness, but since both are different, they do not fall within the same thing, but in different things. The contradiction which is found in the case of the objective content as a whole is assigned to and shared by two objects. The thing is, thus, doubtless as it stands selfsame, but this unity with itself is disturbed by other things. In this way the unity of the thing is preserved, and, at the same time, the otherness is preserved outside the thing, as well as outside consciousness. Now, although the contradiction in the object is in this way allotted to different things, yet the isolated individual thing will still be affected with distinction. The different things have a subsistence on their own account, and the conflict between them takes place on both sides in such a way that each is not different from itself, but only from the other. Each, however, is thereby characterized as a something distinctive, and contains in it essential distinction from the others, but at the same time not in such a way that this is an opposition within its being. On the contrary, it is by itself a simple determinate characteristic which constitutes its essential character, distinguishing it from others. As a matter of fact, since the diversity lies in it, this diversity does indeed necessarily assume the form of a real distinction of manifold qualities within it. But because the determinate characteristic gives the essence of the thing, by which it is distinguished from others, and has a being all its own, this further manifold constitution is something indifferent. The thing thus no doubt contains in its unity the qualifying insofar in two ways, which have, however, unequal significance, and by that qualification this oppositeness becomes not a real opposition on the part of the thing itself, but so far as the thing comes into a condition of opposition through its absolute distinction, this opposition belongs to the thing with reference to another thing lying outside it. The further manifoldness is doubtless necessarily in the thing too, and cannot be left out, but it is unessential to the thing. This determinate characteristic, which constitutes the essential character of the thing and distinguishes it from all others, is now so defined that thereby the thing stands in opposition to others, but must therein preserve itself for itself. It is, however, a thing, a self-existent one, only so far as it does not stand in relation to others. For in this relation, the connection with another is rather the point emphasized, and connection with another means giving up self-existence, means ceasing to have a being on its own account. It is precisely through the absolute character and its opposition that the thing relates itself to others, and is essentially this process of relation, and only this. The relation, however, is the negation of its independence, and the thing collapses through its own essential property. The necessity of the experience which consciousness has to go through in finding that the thing is destroyed just by the very characteristic which constitutes its essential nature and its distinctive existence on its own account, may, as regards the bare principle it implies, be shortly stated thus. The thing is set up as having a being of its own, as existing for itself, or as an absolute negation of all otherness, hence it is absolute negation merely relating itself to itself. But this kind of negation is the cancelling and superseding of itself, or means that it has its essential reality in an other. In point of fact, the determination of the object, as it, the object, has turned out, contains nothing else. It aims at having an essential property, constituting its bare existence for itself, but with this bare self-existence it means also to embrace and contain diversity, which is to be necessary, but is at the same time not to constitute its essential characteristic. But this is a distinction that only exists in words. The non-essential, which has all the same to be necessary, cancels its own meaning, or is what we have just called the negation of itself. With this the last qualifying insofar, which separated self-existence and existence for another, drops away altogether. The object is really in one and the same respect the opposite of itself for itself so far as it is for another, and for another so far as it is for itself. It is for itself, reflected into self, one, but all this is asserted along with its opposite, with its being for another, and for that reason is asserted merely to be superseded. In other words, this existence for itself is as much unessential as that which alone was meant to be unessential, for example, the relation to another. By this process the object in its pure characteristics, in those features which were to constitute its essential nature, is superseded, just as the object in its sensible mode of existence became transcended. From being sensible it passed into being a universal, but this universal, because derived from sense, is essentially conditioned by it, and hence is, in general, not a genuine self-identical universality, but one affected with an opposition. For that reason this universality breaks up into the extremes of singleness and universality, of the one of the properties and the also of the free constituents or matters. These pure determinations appear to express the essential nature itself, but they are merely a self-existence which is fettered at the same time with existence for an other. Since, however, both essentially exist in a single unity, we have before us now unconditioned absolute universality, and it is here that consciousness first truly passes into the sphere of understanding, of intelligence. Sensible singleness thus disappears in the dialectic process of immediate certainty, and becomes universality, but merely sensuous universality. The stage of meaning has vanished, and perceiving takes the object as it inherently is in itself, or, put generally, as a universal. Singleness, therefore, makes its appearance there as true singleness, as the inherent nature of the one, or as reflectedness into self. This is still, however, a conditioned self-existence alongside which appears another self-existence, the universality opposed to singleness and conditioned by it. But these two contradictory extremes are not merely alongside one another, but within one unity, or, what is the same thing, the common element of both. Self-existence is entirely fettered to its opposite, explicitly is, at the same time, not an existence for self. The sophistry of perception seeks to save these moments from their contradiction, tries to keep them fixed by distinguishing between aspects, by using terms like also and so far as, and seeks in like manner to lay hold on the truth by distinguishing the unessential element from an essential nature opposed thereto. But these expedients, instead of keeping away deception from the process of apprehension, prove rather to be of no avail at all, and the real truth, which should be got at through the logic of the perceptual process, proves to be in one and the same aspect the opposite, of what those expedients imply, and consequently to have as its essential content undifferentiated and indeterminate universality. These empty abstractions of singleness and antithetic universality, as also of essence, that is attended with a non-essential element, an element which is all the same necessary, are powers the interplay of which constitutes perceptual understanding, often called sound common sense. This healthy common sense, which takes itself to be the solid substantial type of conscious life, is, in its process of perception, merely the sport of these abstractions. It is always poorest where it means to be richest. In that it is tossed about by these unreal entities, bandied from one to the other, and by its sophistry endeavors to affirm and hold fast alternately now one, then the exact opposite, it sets itself against the truth, and Imagines philosophy has merely to do with things of the intellect, merely manipulates ideas. As a matter of fact, philosophy does have to do with them, too, and knows them to be the pure essential entities, they, absolute powers and ultimate elements. But in doing so, philosophy knows them at the same time in their determinate and specific constitution, and is, therefore, master over them, while that perceptual understanding takes them for the real truth, and is led by them from one mistake to another. It does not get the length of being aware that there are such simple essentialities operating within it and dominating its activity. It thinks it has always to do with quite solid material and content, just as sense certainty is unaware that its essence is the empty abstraction of pure being. But in point of fact it is these essential elements in virtue of which perceptual understanding makes its way hither and thither through every kind of material and content. They are its principle of coherence and control over its varied material. They alone are what constitutes for consciousness the essence of sensuous things, what determines their relations to consciousness, and they are that in the medium of which the process of perceiving, with the truth it contains, runs its course. The course of this process, a perpetual alternate determining of the truth and superseding of this determination, constitutes, properly speaking, the constant everyday life and activity of perceptual intelligence, of the consciousness that thinks it lives and moves in the truth. In that process it advances, without halt or stay, till the final result is reached, when these essential ultimate elements or determinations are all alike superseded, but in each particular moment it is merely conscious of one given characteristic as the truth, and then, again, of the opposite. It no doubt suspects their unessentiality, and, to save them from the impending danger, it takes to the sophistry of now asserting to be true what it had itself just affirmed to be not true. What the nature of these untrue entities really wants to force this understanding to do, for example, to bring together and thereby cancel and transcend the ideas about that universality and singleness, about that essentiality which is necessarily connected with an unessentiality and about an unessential that is yet necessary understanding, strives to resist by leaning for support on the so qualifying terms insofar, a difference of aspect, or by making itself answerable for one idea in order to keep the other separate and preserve it as the true one. But the very nature of these abstractions brings them together as they are and of their own accord. Sound common sense is the prey of these abstractions, they carry understanding round in their whirling circle. When understanding tries to give them truth by at one time taking their untruth upon itself, while at another it calls their deceptiveness a mere appearance due to the uncertainty and unreliability of things, and separates the essential from an element which is necessary to them, and yet is to be unessential, holding the former to be their truth as against the latter, when understanding takes this line, it does not secure them their truth, but convicts itself of untruth. Part 3. Force and the understanding the world of appearance and the supersensible world. Translator's comments: the term force holds primarily with reference to the realm of nature, whether physical or vital, but it is also used, more or less analogically, in reference to other spheres, for example, morality. It is the objective counterpart of the activity of understanding. It is objectively the same kind of relation of unity to differences which is subjectively realized when the mind understands. Force is a self-conditioned principle of unity, the differences are the expressions of force, the unity evolves the differences out of itself. Understanding similarly is a self-conditioned process, it consists in reducing differences to some ultimate unity, which is capable of deriving or explaining those differences from itself. The unconditioned universal to which we are led by the analysis of perception takes shape, therefore, as force. The question is, how are the elements of this unconditioned universal related, and how do they hold together? The answer is found in the highest achievement of the operation of understanding, the establishment of a kingdom of laws, which in its entirety is the meaning of the world so far as understanding goes. But laws per se are looked on as an inner realm, which merely appears in the detailed particulars which those laws control, and in which those laws are made manifest. The differences, in fact, are phenomena, the laws per se are behind the scenes, the world as a whole thus becomes distinguished into a realm of phenomena and a realm of noumena. These two realms set a new problem to the mind, and must again be brought together in a completer way than understanding can do. This new state of consciousness is self-consciousness. In this section we have at once an analysis of empiricism and a criticism of the Kantian solution of the problem of empiricism. It is shown that if phenomena are appearances of noumena, then the noumena do appear, and are, in fact, nothing except so far as they appear, otherwise the noumena, so far being hidden, are worse than appearances, they are illusion. The phenomena are not merely appearances to the mind, but appearances of something that does make itself manifest. If phenomena are thus not external to and still less independent of noumena, noumena are just as truly immanent in phenomena. Treated in any other way, noumena can at best be only another kind of phenomena, and this raises anew precisely the problem which the opposition of phenomena or noumena was intended to solve. Phenomena are related to noumena as the trees to the wood, not as a compound to its atoms. The solution of the difficulty is thus only to be found in the type of consciousness which contains both, and this, Hegel says, is self-consciousness. Consciousness has found seeing and hearing, etc., pass away in the dialectic process of sense experience, and has, at the stage of perception, arrived at thoughts which, however, it brings together in the first instance in the unconditioned universal. This unconditioned element, again, if it were taken as inert essence bare and simple, would itself be nothing else than the one-sided extreme of self-existence, for the non-essential would then stand over against it. But if thus related to the latter, it would be itself unessential, and consciousness would not have got disentangled from the deceptions of perception, whereas this universal has proved to be one which has passed out of such conditioned separate existence and returned into itself. This unconditioned universal, which henceforward is the true object of consciousness, is still objective consciousness. Consciousness has not yet grasped its principle, or notion, qua notion. There is an essential distinction between the two which must be drawn. On the one hand, consciousness is aware that the object has passed from its relation to another back into itself, and thereby become inherently and implicitly notion, but, on the other hand, consciousness is not yet the notion explicitly or for itself, and consequently it does not know itself in that reflected object. We, who are analyzing experience, found this object arise through the process of consciousness in such a way that consciousness is implicated and involved in the development of the object, and the reflection is the same on both sides, to wit, there is only one reflection. But because in this movement consciousness had as its content merely the objective entity, and not consciousness as such, the result has to be given an objective significance for consciousness, however, still withdrawing from what has arisen, so that the latter in objective form is the essential reality to consciousness. Understanding has, indeed, done away with its own untruth and the untruth in its object. What has thereby come to view is the notion of the truth as implicit inherent truth, which is not yet notion, or lacks a consciously explicit existence for itself, and is something which understanding allows to have its way without knowing itself in it. It pursues its own nature by itself, so that consciousness has no share in its process of free realization, but merely looks on and apprehends that realization as a naked fact. It is, consequently, our business in the first instance to step into its place and be the notion, which works up into shape what is contained in the result. With this complete formation of the object, which is presented to consciousness as a bare existent fact, mere implicit awareness then first becomes to itself conceptual consciousness, conscious comprehension. The result arrived at was the unconditioned universal, in the first instance in the negative and abstract sense that consciousness negated its one-sided notions and abstracted them, it surrendered them. This result, however, has inherently a positive significance. It has established the unity of existence for self, and existence for another. In other words, absolute opposites are immediately posited as one and the same reality. At first this seems to affect merely the formal relation of the moments to one another. But to be for self and to be for another constitutes the content itself as well, because the opposition, looked at truly, can have no other nature than what has come about in the result. For example, that the content, taken in perception for truth, belongs, in point of fact, solely to the form, and is dissipated into its unity. This content is at the same time universal. There can be no other content which by its peculiar constitution would refuse to return into this unconditioned universality. Such a content would be some specific way or other of being for itself and taking up a relation to something else. But to be in general for self and to stand in relation to something else constitutes the very nature and meaning of that whose truth lies in being unconditionally universal, and the result is through and through universal. Since, however, this unconditioned universal is an object for consciousness, the distinction of form and content makes its appearance within it, and, in the shape of content, the moments have the aspect in which they were first presented, that of being on one side a universal medium of many substantial elements, and, on the other, a unit reflected into self, where their substantial independence is overthrown and done away with. The former dissolves the independence of the thing, is the condition of passivity which consists in being something for something else, the latter is its individual subsistence, its being something on its own account. We have to see what shape these moments take in the unconditioned universal which is their essential nature. It is obvious at the outset that by existing only in this universal they do not at all lie any longer apart from one another, but rather are in themselves essentially self-cancelling aspects, and what is established is only their transition into one another. One moment, then, appears as universal medium, or as the subsistence of independent constituents, as the reality that has stepped aside. The independence of these constituent elements, however, is nothing else than this medium, to wit, this universal is simply and entirely the plurality of such diverse universals. That the universal is per se in undivided unity with this plurality means, however, that these elements are each where the other is, they mutually permeate one another without touching one another, because, conversely, the manifold diversity is equally independent. Along with that, too, goes the fact that they are absolutely pervious and porous, or are cancelled and superseded. To be thus superseded, again, or the reduction of this diversity to bare and simple self-existence, is nothing else than the medium itself, and this is the independence of the different elements. In other words, the elements set up as independent pass directly over into their unity, and their unity directly into its explicit diversity, and the latter back once again into the reduction to unity. This process is what is called force. One of its moments, where force takes the form of a dispersion of the independent elements each with a being of its own, is the expression of force. When, however, force takes the form of that wherein they disappear and vanish, it is force proper, force withdrawn from expressing itself and driven back into itself. But in the first place force driven back into itself must express itself, and, secondly, in that expression it is still force existing within itself, as much as in thus being within itself it is expression. When we thus keep both moments in this immediate unity, it is understanding, to which the conception of force belongs, that is, properly speaking, the principle which carries the different moments qua different. For per se they are not to be different, the distinction consequently exists only in thought. Stated otherwise, only the mere conception of force has been put forward in the above, not its realization. In point of fact, however, force is the unconditioned universal, which is in itself just what it is for something else, or which holds difference within itself, for difference is nothing else than existence for another. Hence for force to be what it truly is, it has to be completely set free from thought, and put forward as the substantial reality of these differences, that is, first the substance its entire force remaining essentially self-contained, and then its differences as substantial entities, or as moments subsisting each on its own account. Force as such, force as driven back within itself, is in this way by itself an excluding unit, for which the unfolding of the elements or differences is another thing subsisting separately, and thus there are set up two sides, distinct and independent. But force is also the whole, or it remains what, in its very conception, it is, that is to say, these differences remain mere forms, superficial vanishing moments. The differences between force proper, withdrawn into itself, and force unfolded and expressed in independent constituent elements, would at the same time have no being at all if they had no subsistence, to wit, force would have no being if it did not really exist in these opposite ways. But to exist in this way as opposite aspects means nothing else than that both moments are themselves at the same time independent. It is this process we have now to deal with, the process by which both moments get themselves fixed as independent and then cancel their independence again. Looked at broadly, it is manifest that this process nothing else than the process of perceiving, where the aspects, both percipient and content perceived, are at once inseparably united as regards the process of grasping the truth, and yet, by that very fact, each aspect is at the same time reflected into itself, is something on its own account. In the present case, these two aspects are elements or moments of force. They subsist within one unity, just as much as this unity, which appears as the middle term for the distinct and independent extremes, always gets broken up into these very extremes, which only are through this taking place. Thus the process, which formerly took the shape of the self-negation of contradictory conceptions, here assumes objective form, and is a movement of force, the result of which is to bring out the unconditioned universal, as something which is not objective, which is the inner, unperceived, being of things. Force, as thus determined, since it is taken as force, or as reflected into itself, is the one side of its notion and meaning, but a substantiated extreme, and, moreover, the extreme established with the specific character of oneness. In virtue of this, the subsistence of the differentiated elements falls outside it, and is something other than it. Since of necessity it has, to be this subsistence, to wit, to express, externalize itself, its expression takes the form that the other approaches it and incites it. But, in point of fact, since it must necessarily express itself, it has within itself this other, which to begin with took up a position as something outside it. We must withdraw from the position which sets up force as a one, and its essence self-expressions and other approaching it from outside. Force is rather itself this universal medium for the subsistence of the moments as differentiated elements, or, in other words, it has expressed or externalized itself, and what was to be something outside it attracting or inciting it is really force itself. It thus exists now as the medium of the differentiated elements which are evolved. But all the same it is in its very nature one and single, and has essentially the form of being that in which these subsisting elements are superseded. This oneness is in consequence now something other than, external to, force, since force takes its place as the medium for the elements to exist in, and force therefore has this its essential being outside itself. Since, however, it must of necessity be this essential nature, which as yet it is not affirmed to be, this other comes forward soliciting or inciting it to reflect into self, to turn this pseudo-external factor into an aspect of itself. In other words, this other cancels its external expression. In point of fact, however, it is force itself that is thus reflected into self, that is the sublation of the external expression. The oneness vanishes as it appeared, for example, as something external. Force is that very other, is force thrust back into itself. What took the character of an external other, and incited force at once to expression and to return into self, turns out directly to be itself force, for the other shows itself to be universal medium as well as one and single, and shows this in such a way that each of the forms assumed appears at the same time to be merely a vanishing moment. Consequently force, in that there is an other for it, and it is for an other, has as a whole not yet developed its complete meaning. There are two forces present at the same time, the notion of both is no doubt the same notion, but it has passed out of its unity into duality. Instead of the opposition continuing to be entirely and essentially a mere moment, it appears to have escaped from the control of the unity and to have become, owing to this diremption, two quite independent forces. We have now to see more precisely what sort of situation this independence introduces. To begin with, the second force stands towards the force incited in the character of inciting force, and, moreover, with respect to its content, plays the part of universal medium. But since that second force consists essentially in an alternation of these two moments and is itself force, it is likewise, in point of fact, universal medium only then when it is incited or solicited to being so, and in the same way, too, it is negative unity, or incites and leads to the retraction of force, only by being incited thereto. As a result, this distinction, which took place between one force regarded as inciting and the other as incited, turns also into one and the same reciprocal interchange of characteristics. The interplay of the two forces in this way arises from and consists in the two being thus determined with opposite characteristics, in their being for one another in virtue of this determination and in the complete and exchange of their characteristics, a transition direct from one to the other, whereby alone these determinations, in which the forces seem to appear independently, have being. For example, the inciting force is set up as universal medium, and, on the other hand, the force incited as a force repressed. But the former is universal medium just by the very fact of the latter being repressed, that is to say, this latter is really what incites the former, and makes it the medium it claims to be. The former gets the character it has only through the other, and is an inciting force only so far as it is incited by the latter to be so. And it loses just as readily this character given to it, for this character passes, or rather has already passed, into the character of the other. The former, acting in an external way, takes the part of universal medium, but only by its having been incited by the other force to do so. This means, however, that the latter gives it that position, and is really itself essentially universal medium. It gives the inciting agency this character just because this other character is essentially its own, to wit, because it is really its own self. To complete our insight into the principle of this process, we may notice, further, that the distinctions themselves reveal distinction in a twofold manner. They are, on the one hand, distinctions of content, since one extreme is force reflected into itself, while the other is a medium for the constituent elements involved. On the other hand, they appear as distinctions of form, since one incites and the other is incited, the former being active, the latter passive. As regards the distinction of content, they are in fact distinct, or distinct for us who are analyzing the process. As regards distinction of form, however, they are independent, in their relation parting asunder of themselves, and standing opposed. In the perception of the movement of force, consciousness becomes aware that the extremes, in both these aspects, are nothing per se, that rather these sides, in which their distinction of nature was meant to consist, are merely vanishing moments, an immediate transition of each into its opposite. For us, however, who are analyzing the process, it was also true, as stated above, that per se the distinctions, qua distinctions of content and form, vanished, and on the side of form, the active, inciting, or independent factor was in its very nature the same as what, from the side of content, was presented as repressed force, force driven back into itself. The passive, incited, or related factor was, from the side of form, the same as what, from the side of content, took shape as universal medium for the many constituent elements. From this we see that the notion of force becomes actual when resolved into two forces, and we see too how it comes to be so. These two forces exist as independent entities, but their existence lies in a movement each towards each, of such a kind that in order to be, each has in reality to get its position purely through the other, that is to say, their being has purely the significance of disappearance. They are not like extremes that keep to themselves something positively fixed, and merely transmit an external property to one another through their common medium and by external contact. They are what they are solely in this medium and in their contact with each other. We have there immediately both force as it is independently, force repressed within itself, and also its expression, force inciting and force being incited. These moments are thus not allotted to two independent extremes, offering each other only an opposite pole, rather their true nature consists simply in each being solely through the other, and in each ceasing to be what it thus is through the other, since it is the other. They have thus, in point of fact, no substances of their own which could support and maintain them. The notion of force rather maintains itself as the essence in its very actuality. Force when actual exists wholly and only in its expression, and this, at the same time, is nothing else than a process of cancelling itself. This actual force, when represented as detached from its expression and existing by itself, is force driven back into itself, but this feature is itself, in point of fact, as appears from the foregoing, merely a moment in the expression of force. The true nature of force thus remains merely the thought or idea of force, the moments in its realization, its substantial independence in its process, rush, without let or hindrance, together into one single undivided unity, a unity which is not force withdrawn into itself, for this is merely one of those moments, but is its notion qua notion. The realization of force is, then, at the same time dissipation or loss of reality. It has thereby become something quite different, for example, this universality, which understanding knows from the start or immediately to be its essential nature, and which shows itself, too, to be the essence of it in what is supposed to be its reality, in the actual substances. So far as we look on the first universal as the notion of understanding, where force does not yet exist for itself, the second is now its essential reality, as it is revealed in and for itself. Or, conversely, if we look on the first universal as the immediate, which should be an actual object for consciousness, then this second has the characteristic of being the negative of sensuously objective force. It is force, in the form in which, in its true being, force exists merely as object for understanding. The first would be force withdrawn into itself, to wit, force as substance. The second, however, is the inner being of things qua inner, which is one and the same with the notion qua notion. This true being of things has here the characteristic that it does not exist immediately for consciousness, rather, consciousness takes up a mediated relation to the inner. In the form of understanding, it looks through the intervening play of forces into the real and true background of things. The middle term combining the two extremes, understanding and the inner of things, is the explicitly evolved being of force, which is now and henceforth a vanishing process for understanding itself. Hence it is called appearance, for being which is per se straightway non-being we call a show, a semblance. It is, however, not merely a show, but appearance, a totality of seeming. This totality as totality or universal is what makes up the inner world, the play of forces in the sense of its reflection into itself. Their consciousness has before itself in objective form the things of perception as they truly are, to wit, as moments turning, without halt or separate subsistence, directly into their opposite, the one changing immediately into the universal, the essential becoming at once something unessential, and vice versa. This play of forces is consequently the development of the negative, but its true nature is the positive element, for example, the universal, the implicit object, the object existing per se. The being of this object for consciousness is mediated through the movement of appearance, by which the content of perception and the sensuous objective world as a whole, get merely negative significance. Their consciousness is turned back upon itself as the truth, but, being consciousness, it again makes this truth into an inner being of the object, and distinguishes this reflection of things from its own reflection into self, just as the mediating process likewise is for it still an objective process. This inner nature is therefore for it an extreme placed over against it. But it is on that account the truth for it, because therein, as in something essentially real, it possesses at the same time the certainty of its own self, the moment of its own self-existence. But it is not yet conscious of this basis its self-existence, for the independence, its being on its own account, which should have the inner world within it, would be nothing else than the negative process. This negative process, however, is for consciousness still objective vanishing appearance, and not yet its own proper self-existence. Hence the inner is no doubt taken to be notion, but consciousness does yet know the nature of the notion. Within this inner truth, this absolute universal which has got rid of the opposition between universal and particular, and become the object of understanding, is a supersensible world which henceforth opens up as the true world, lying beyond the sensuous world which is the world of appearance. Away remote from the changing vanishing present lies the permanent beyond, an immanent inherent reality, which is the first and therefore imperfect manifestation of reason, to wit, it is merely the pure element where the truth finds its abode and its essential being. Our object henceforward has thus the form of a syllogistic inference, whose extremes are the inner being of things and understanding, and its middle term the sphere of appearance. The course of this inferential process, however, furnishes the further characterization of what understanding detects in the inner world by the aid of the middle term, and gives rise to the experience understanding goes through regarding this relation of the terms when joined and united together. The inner world is so far for consciousness a bare and simple beyond, because consciousness does not as yet find itself in it. It is empty, for it is the nothingness of appearance, and positively the naked universal. This type of inwardness suits those who say that the inner being of things cannot be known, but the reason for the position would have to be taken in some other sense. Certainly there is no knowledge to be had of this inner world, as we have it here, not, however, owing to reason being too short-sighted, or limited, or whatever you care to call it. On this point there is as yet nothing known at this stage, we have not gone deep enough for that yet, but on account simply of the nature of the case, because in the void there is nothing known, or, putting it from the point of view of the other side, because its very characteristic lies in being beyond consciousness. The result is, of course, the same if you place a blind man amid the wealth of the supersensible world, if it has a wealth, whether this be a content peculiarly its own, or whether consciousness itself be this content, and if you place one with sight in absolute darkness, or, if you like, in pure light, supposing the supersensible world to be this. The seeing man sees in that pure light as little as in absolute darkness, and just as much as the blind man in the ample wealth which lay before him. If there were nothing more to be done with the inner sphere and with our being bound up along with it by means of the world of appearance, then there would be nothing left but to stop at the phenomenal world, to wit, take something for truth about which we know that it is not true. Or in order that there may be something in this empty void which, while it originally came about as a state devoid of objective things, has, however, since it is emptiness pure and simple, to be taken to be also devoid of all mental relations and distinctions of consciousness qua consciousness, in order that in this complete vacuity, which is even called the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary, there may yet be something, we should be driven to fill it up with dreamings, appearances produced by consciousness itself. It would have to be content with being treated so badly, for it would not deserve anything better, since even dreams are something better than its own barren emptiness. The inner world, or the supersensible beyond, has, however, arisen. It comes to us out of the sphere of appearance, and the latter is its mediating agency. In other words, appearance is its essential nature and, in point of fact, its filling. The supersensible is the established truth of the sensible and perceptual. The truth of the sensible and the perceptual lies, however, in being appearance. The supersensible is then appearance qua appearance. We distort the proper meaning of this, if we take it to mean that the supersensible is therefore the sensible world, or the world as it is for immediate sense certainty, and perception. For, on the contrary, appearance is just not the world of sense knowledge and perception as positively being, but this world as superseded or established in truth as an inner world. It is often said that the supersensible is not appearance, but by appearance is thereby meant not appearance, but rather the sensible world taken as itself real actuality. Understanding, which is our object here, finds itself in this position, that, for it, the inner world has come about to begin with, only as the implicit inherent being, universal and still without a filling. The play of forces has simply and solely this negative significance of not being something per se, and its only positive significance is that of being the mediating agency, but outside understanding. The relation of understanding to the inner world through mediation is, however, its own process, by which the inner world will be found to receive fullness of content. The play of forces is what understanding has directly to do with, but the real truth for it is the inner world bare and simple. The movement of force is consequently the truth only by being in like manner something simple. Regarding this play of forces, however, we saw that its peculiarity lay in this, that the force which is awakened into activity by another force is just on that account the inciting agency for this other force, which thereby itself only then becomes an inciting force. We have here in this way merely direct and immediate interchange or complete exchange of the characteristic which constitutes the sole content of what comes before us, for example, the fact of being either universal medium or negative unity. It ceases immediately on its entrance in determinate form to be what it was on entering. It awakens or incites, by its appearance in determinate shape, the other side, which thereby gives itself expression, to wit, the latter is now directly what the first was to be. Each of these two sides, the relation of inciting and the relation of the opposed determinate content, is on its own account an absolute process of permutation and transposition. But these two relations are again themselves one and the same, and the formal distinction of being incited and of inciting to activity is the same as the distinction of content, to wit, the distinction between the incited factor as such, for example, the passive medium, on the one side, and the inciting factor, for example, the active medium, the negative unity, or the one on the other side. In this way there disappears all distinction of contrasted and opposed particular forces, which were meant to be present in this process, for they rested solely on the above distinctions. And, along with both those distinctions, the distinction between the forces collapses likewise into merely one. There is thus neither force nor inciting and being incited to action, nor the characteristic of being a stable medium and a unity reflected into self. There is neither a particular which is something on its own account, nor are there diverse opposites. What is found in this flux of thoroughgoing change is merely difference as universal difference, or difference into which the various opposites have been resolved. This difference as universal, consequently is what constitutes the ultimate simple element in that play of forces, and is the resultant truth of that process. It is the law of force. The absolute flux of the world of appearance passes into bare and simple difference through its relation to the simplicity of the inner being, the simplicity apprehended by understanding. The inner being is in the first instance merely the implicit universal. This implicit simple universal, however, is essentially absolute universal difference as well, for it is the outcome of the change itself, or change is its very nature. But change, when planted in the inner reality as it change truly is, forthwith is taken up into that reality as equally absolute universal difference at peace with itself, and remaining at one with itself. In other words, negation is an essential moment of the universal, and negation or mediation in what is universal difference. This difference is expressed in the law, which is the stable presentment or picture of unstable appearance. The supersensible world is in this way a quiescent kingdom of laws, no doubt beyond the world of perception, for this exhibits the law only through incessant change but likewise present in it, and its direct immovable copy or image. This kingdom of laws is indeed the truth for understanding, and that truth finds its content in the distinction which lies in the law. At the same time, however, this kingdom of laws is only the preliminary truth and does not give all the fullness of the world of appearance. The law is present therein, but is not all the appearance present. Under ever-varying circumstances the law has an ever-varying actual existence. Thereby appearance continues to keep one aspect which is not in the inner world, to wit, appearance is not yet in very truth established as appearance, as that whose independent being has been done away with. This defect in the law has to be brought out in the law itself. What seems defective in it is that while it no doubt has difference within it, it contains this in a merely universal indeterminate way. So far, however, as it is not law in general, but a law, it has determinateness within it, and as a result there are found an indeterminate plurality of laws. But this plurality is rather itself a defect. It contradicts the principle of understanding, for which, since it is consciousness of the simple inner being, truth is the inherently universal unity. It must, therefore, let the many laws coalesce into a single law, just as, for example, the law by which a stone falls, and that by which the heavenly bodies move have been conceived as one law. When the laws thus coincide, however, they lose their specific character. The law becomes more and more abstract and superficial, and in consequence we find as a fact, not the unity of these various determinate laws, but a law which leaves out their specific character, just as the one law, which combines in itself the laws of falling terrestrial bodies, and of the movements of celestial bodies, does not, in point of fact, express both kinds of laws. The unification of all laws in universal attraction expresses no further content than just the bare concept of the law itself, a concept which is therein set down as existing. Universal attraction says merely that everything has a constant distinction for anything else. Understanding pretends by that to have found a universal law which gives expression to universal reality as such, but, in point of fact, it has merely found the conception of law itself, although in such a way that it at the same time thereby declares all reality to be in its very nature conformed to law. The idea of universal attraction has, therefore, to this extent great importance, that it is directed against that unthinking way of representing reality, to which everything appears in the shape of accident and chance, and for which determinateness, specificity, takes the form of sensuous independence. In contrast, then, with determinate laws stands universal attraction, or the bare conception of law. In so far as this pure conception is looked on as the essentially real, or as the true inner being, the determinateness characterizing the specific law itself belongs still to the sphere of appearance, or rather to sensible existence. But the pure conception of law transcends not merely the law, which, being itself a determinate law, stands contrasted with other determinate laws, but also transcends law as such. The determinateness, of which we spoke, is itself strictly a mere vanishing moment which can no longer come forward here as an essential entity, for it is only the law which is the truth here, but the conception of law is turned against the law itself. That is to say, in the law distinction itself is immediately apprehended and taken up into the universal, thereby, however, making the moments, whose relation it expresses, subsist as mutually indifferent and inherently real entities. These parts of the distinction found in the law are, however, at the same time themselves determinate aspects. The pure concept of law, as universal attraction, must, to get its true significance, be so apprehended that in it, as the absolutely single and simple, the distinctions which are present in law as such, return again themselves into the inner being, qua bare and simple unity. This unity is the inner necessity of the law. The law is thereby present in a twofold form. In one case it is there as law in which the differences are expressed as independent moments, in the other it is in the form of a simple withdrawal into itself, which again can be called force, but in the sense not of repressed force spoken of above, but force in general, or the concept of force, an abstraction which absorbs the distinctions involved in what attracts and is attracted. In this sense, for example, simple electricity is force. The expression of difference falls, however, within the law. This difference is positive and negative electricity. In the case of the motion of falling bodies, force is the simple element, gravity, which has the law that the magnitudes of the different factors in the motion, the time spent, and the space traversed, are to one another in the relation of root and square. Electricity itself is not difference per se, is not in its essential nature a twofold entity consisting of positive and negative electricity, hence it is often said it has the law of being so and so in the way indicated, or again, that it has the property of expressing itself in this fashion. This property is doubtless the essential and peculiar property of this force, to wit, it belongs to it necessarily. But necessity is here an empty phrase. Force must, just because it must, duplicate itself in this manner. Of course, if positive electricity is given, negative electricity is inherently necessary, for the positive element only is by being related to a negative. In other words, the positive element in its very self involves difference from itself, just in the same way as the negative does. But that electricity as such should break itself up into parts in this way, this is not in itself a necessity. Electricity qua simple force is indifferent to its law to be in the form of positive and negative, and if we call the former its notion and the latter its being, then its notion is indifferent to its being, it merely has this as a property, which just means that this is not per se necessary to it. This indifference takes another form when it is said that to be positive and negative is involved in the definition of electricity, or that this is neither more nor less than its notion and its essence. Its being in that case would mean its existence in general. But in that definition the necessity of its existence is not contained, it exists either because we find it, to wit, its existence is not necessary at all, or else it exists through other forces, to wit, the necessity of its existence is an external necessity. But in that the determinateness of being through another is what the necessity consists in, we are back again to the plurality of determinate laws, which we have just left in order to consider law, as law. It is only with the latter that we can compare its notion as notion, or its necessity. This necessity, however, has in all these forms shown itself to be just an empty phrase.